Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the two curators' introductions to two related exhibitions, Landseer's Monarch of the Glen and Rachel Maclean's The Lion and the Unicorn. I'm Susan Foister. I'm the curator for Landseer's Monarch of the Glen. I'm curator of British painting, among other things.
And my name is Daniel Herrmann. I'm the curator of special projects here at the National Gallery, and I was lucky enough to work both with Susan but also with the artist Rachel Maclean on her display, The Lion and the Unicorn.
And we've worked very closely together, it's fair to say, and that we actually went up to Glasgow together to visit Rachel in her studio, which was a great beginning to the collaboration. So I just want to say a few words about how we got to display this extremely famous painting, Landseer's Monarch of the Glen. This is a painting that the National Galleries of Scotland acquired last year. It's a painting that had been on loan to them for a very long time. Daniel, who used to work up in Edinburgh, probably remembers the painting being on display. And so they were absolutely delighted when they had the opportunity to acquire it for the permanent collection. They've been touring it around the Highlands for quite a bit, allowing people in far-flung places of Scotland to see the picture. But they asked us whether we would be at all interested in showing it here in London at the National Gallery. And of course, we jumped at that great opportunity. Daniel, how did the showing of Rachel Maclean come about?
Well, I'm quite lucky insofar that I joined the National Gallery about a year ago with the remit of restructuring our program of modern and contemporary art here at the National Gallery, the way that we use exhibitions and displays to provide somewhat of a prism through which to look at our historic collections with and to have a chance to raise new questions, ask different things and really gain new perspectives. And I was also very lucky that in my conversations with Susan, we quite quickly found that there is a lot of overlap of Landseer and the Monarch of the Glen's image history, the idea of how an image gets proliferated, becomes a popular image, becomes an image that is very well known to a lot of people, and by that also contributes to how a particular region, in this case Scotland, is perceived. While we were discussing that, we were also thinking, well, it would be really interesting actually to show a contemporary Scottish artist whose works and whose work and practice really reflects that very notion, how images are being used, how images of the past gain a new life, and also how national identities and the way we visualize them gets created. And that's really what Rachel Maclean does. And I think that's what makes for the interesting dialogue between these two exhibitions.
Absolutely. So we'll come to Rachel's work in just a moment, but we want to start off with Landseer and with the famous Monarch of the Glen.
Susan, do you remember when the first time was that you saw the Monarch of the Glen?
That's a very good question. It must have been years ago, making visits to the National Galleries of Scotland in Edinburgh, when it hung very high up. And in fact, a few people have said to me about this show here, oh, I'm so used to seeing it high up. I've never seen it so close before.
It was originally conceived for a high way of display, is that correct?
Well, we think so. Landseer was the most famous painter of his day in the Victorian era, Queen Victoria's famous artist. And in the 1840s, he was given one of the great public commissions that resulted in him painting the Monarch of the Glen. And we've slightly turned around, I suppose, Landseer as the great painter of the Scottish Highlands in this exhibition, because we want to talk a little bit about the great commissions for London and Trafalgar Square. We'll come to Trafalgar Square in a moment. But of course, in the 1840s, many artists were being commissioned to paint for the Houses of Parliament, which had burned down famously in the 1830s. There was this wonderful new Gothic building going up, the building we see now, although it's half shrouded in polythene at the moment. I think everybody knows it. But not everybody knows that Landseer was commissioned to paint this picture and two others for the refreshment rooms of the House of Lords. So he was going to make 3 paintings that had to go along with lords eating their food. And he perhaps drew inspiration from that great tradition going back to the 17th century in the Low Countries, where artists like Rubens and Snyders made these great paintings of food of different types, which often included game of all kinds, food of all kinds, cornucopia of food, was suitable for paintings in dining rooms. We don't really know what else Landseer had planned, because there seems to be no trace at all of the other 2 paintings he was commissioned for. Interestingly, they probably were meant to hang quite high up in the refreshment rooms, but the money ran out. So what Landseer did then was to make the best of the situation and to put Monarch of the Glen on view in the Royal Academy's annual exhibition. And at that time, in 1851, the Royal Academy shared the National Gallery's building. The Wilkins building that you see from Trafalgar Square was the left-hand side, the National Gallery, and the right-hand side, the Royal Academy. And so Landseer's Monarch of the Glen first got its public viewings in the National Gallery rooms alongside great paintings by Pre-Raphaelites and many other Victorian artists. It's really extraordinary, I think, to think of that now.
Yeah, in a way, it's a certain homecoming of the stag to Trafalgar Square.
It absolutely is. It's a homecoming, and it's a London aspect to what otherwise perhaps seems a very Scottish image.
And I think in that way it's also a testament to the just Anglo-Scottish relationships, that they've always been built on politics, on trade, on culture, on individual relationships, and on artistic exchange of artists coming to London, going to Scotland, and vice versa. And I think Landseer is just a fantastic example of that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the painting, after it was exhibited at the Royal Academy, was sold privately. And it passed through the hands of a few private owners. But that didn't mean that it didn't become even more well-known, even while Landseer was still alive, because his brother Thomas was an engraver. And so a lot of his work came from making engravings of Landseer's paintings. And that was one of the ways of popularizing art and imagery in Victorian England. You could buy or subscribe to editions of engravings after very famous paintings, often the ones that have been shown at the Royal Academy. So Landseer's painting became immensely well known in the second half of the 19th century. And then it came into the possession of the Dewars. And the Dewars, of course, I'm sure you know from your time in Scotland, were the owners of a whisky brand. And so that became the Monarch's path to fame in the 20th century, being shown on whisky bottles, but also on the labels of many other products, including soap and soup, for example. So it's an image that has really never escaped our public consciousness.
I think that kind of image archaeology is really interesting to me. My very personal background is not just as a curator at the National Galleries of Scotland originally, but also to be very involved with the Cabinet of Prints and Drawings there. And one of the interesting histories of art in the 19th century is also the more and more proliferated image circulation. We have printmaking, but we also have the development of photography and the development of advertisement. So the idea of being able to reproduce an image via engraving, but later also via photo engraving and photolithography to make it for particular uses of popular context, be it, I think you mentioned soap labels, whiskey labels, products of everyday use, really endeared this painting and image as a derivative of that painting to an entire nation, I'd say.
Well, we'll come back to the notion of the Monarch of the Glen as an image in a moment. But let's just take a moment to look at it a bit more closely as a painting and talk about how Landseer came to create this extremely striking image. Because it was a work that was in a way, definitive of his career and his representation of animals. And it was a very different image of a stag. We'll see in a moment a painting that Landseer painted much earlier in his career. But it's this focus on the animal, completely alone, with no people, no hint of people around it, that I think is so powerful and so striking. When it was shown at the Royal Academy, there was a piece of poetry printed alongside it. It was often the case with those catalogues. And it was a piece of verse about this stag stepping out in the early morning mist and sort of sniffing the air around him. And I think in the way that Landseer has posed the animal, the way that he looks to the left, he seems to be looking about him, you get that sense. And of course, you've got the mist, which is going to perhaps disperse as the sun comes up and the day gets hotter. And then you've got that very extraordinary compositional device in which that stag is absolutely right in front of you, right in front of us. And in reality, of course, a stag would have sensed human beings so close. So in the painting, Landseer is doing something that could almost never happen in real life. And it's that gives that sense, I think, that he really is the monarch of all he surveys.
I think it's interesting also to think about the way the animal is represented and what we see. The actual antlers, there's 12 points to it, so it's one of the largest set of antlers that a stag can grow. And I believe there's also a link to hunting privileges. Is that correct?
Perhaps you know more about that than I do.
I see that might be something I need to look up, but there's it's something that's very rare and thus as an animal very desired, and the label of the monarch also, I believe, comes from this 12-point antler, almost crown. And what I find interesting when I think about how we view the painting, looking from our position as viewers into this fictional space, the stag actually looks above us. So he surveys us as people looking at the painting as much as we look at him from a slightly lower angle from our position of view.
I think it sort of suggests a completely different relationship between the animal and the natural world and the human world. And it's one that actually people in recent years have associated with the rise of a different kind of understanding of creation, the rise of Darwinism. And we know that actually Darwin did have some images by Landseer in his study. So Landseer and his view of the animal perhaps had a bearing on Darwin's own thinking, which is very interesting. What I think is also interesting is to think a bit about how Landseer constructed this image, which has such associations with Scotland and the Scottish Highlands, because he painted it here in London in his studio in St John's Wood. We know that he kept a menagerie there so that he could study animals. He'd been studying animals very, very closely right from the start of his career. If you go into the exhibition, you'll see some examples of his close studies. But he would have had deer in the menagerie, so he had every opportunity to study them very close at hand. He would also have had a number of his landscape sketches. He made beautiful oil sketches and oil paintings of landscapes. I was sorry we didn't have enough room to include any in the exhibition. So that's something that he was also bringing into this painting. And then, as I think we'll see perhaps even better in the next slide, Landseer is a beautiful painter. And that was one of the reasons that I was very excited that we were going to show his work in the National Gallery, as I hope you can see very well in the detail, where you can see the way in which he creates the effect of dew on the ground, like sea spray almost, and the wonderful way in which with his brush he's given you the sense of the coat of the stag.
The landscape itself, Susan, do we know if it's, we know it's not a plein air painting. He didn't stand in Scotland with a palette and an easel. Do we know where the geography comes from? Is it a realistic one? Is it a composite one that's pieced together from different places? How does it work?
I think it's not intended to be topographical. I'm sure there probably are people who will say, oh, I recognise that particular mountain range and those glens. So perhaps composite is the more accurate way of thinking about it. He wanted a glorious and impressive mountain background to set off the image of this single stag. If we just take the next slide, which is a painting that's included in our exhibitions. It's a painting in a private collection, one that's normally on loan to the National Galleries of Scotland. I think we can just see how far Landseer moved from this painting, which he made in the middle of the 1820s, to the Monarch of the Glen, and what an extraordinary image it then is. So this is a very busy painting because it includes portraits of Landseer's great patron and lover, the Duchess of Bedford, on the right, and her family, her brother and her son. It does include a beautiful landscape, which may well be more specific than the one to Monarch. And it also includes a whole variety of animals, alive and dead. It celebrates a day out in the Scottish Highlands for this aristocratic family.
And it uses some aspects of what we can see, or what we immediately recognize as, oh, this must be a Scottish painting, that were in themselves also creations, composites, and constructions. I'm looking at the tartans, I'm looking at some of these elements that are being put into the painting almost as signposts and signifiers of here we are in a particular place and time.
I think it speaks to the romanticisation of the Scottish Highlands in the 19th century by Landseer's patrons and then translated into paint by Landseer himself. These aristocrats who liked to dress up in the traditional tartans, the plaids, which were worn by native Scottish people who were obviously much poorer, but it was becoming extremely popular to spend time each year in Scotland hunting. So Landseer himself went up to Scotland from the early 1820s, from a very young age. He met Sir Walter Scott, who in his books was also responsible for this popular romantic idea of the history of Scotland. And then from 1842, Queen Victoria herself and Prince Albert would come up to Scotland every year, and of course that resulted in them making Balmoral Castle their summer residence in the Highlands. But I suppose it's easy to forget in the face of these images what life in Scotland was like for ordinary people in the 1840s, for example. We know that they had in Scotland a potato famine, just like in Ireland at that time. It wasn't as devastating as the potato famine in Ireland, but nevertheless, people were extremely poorly off in the Highlands of Scotland. So what we're seeing here is a very partial and rather romanticised view of Scotland.
Which very often also was contested by later generations of Scottish citizens and Scots in general, in terms of how their own place was represented in art by others. What I notice when I look at the painting is also just his real interest in animal anatomy,
yes.
In animal, well, also composition. And I think that's a real link to another London aspect of Landseer that I think the show shows that we rarely get to see, and that's the lions in Trafalgar Square.
The lions in Trafalgar Square, a commission that Landseer was given in 1858 that cost him several years of his life, and presented him with perhaps a degree of difficulty and challenge that he had not previously encountered in his illustrious career as a painter of animals. This, of course, is one of the lions. I'm sure we all know them very well. They're on view just outside the gallery. But this was a very controversial commission because Landseer was a painter, and so he immediately got a bad press. Why is this painter being given a commission to make sculptures of lions? Well, others had turned down this commission. Nelson's column, the monument, had been up in Trafalgar Square long since, but it was still not yet completed by the 4 sculptures of lions at its base. So Landseer took on the commission, and he seems to have felt slightly paralysed by it, because it took him several years to actually produce the sculptures, and then he needed a bit of help to do them as well. If you go into the exhibition, you'll see some of the beautiful drawings of lions that he made, and also a large oil sketch, a life-size sketch of a lion at London Zoo. By that time, Landseer was very frequently visiting London Zoo specifically to record images of lions. But when it came to actually making the sculptures, as we see here, he needed the help of a professional sculptor, Carlo Marrachetti. And so the painter John Ballantyne has shown him here in Marrachetti's studio, working on these clay sculptures that were going to be cast in bronze to make the images that we see today.
And yeah, this image after an image, I think, is a nice little segue to another work in the show. Then not only can you see of those 2 lion paintings, you can see the drawing of a lion in the corner of a painting. This is also one of the modern works that we have in that exhibition.
Well, we're very fortunate to be able to include this painting in a private collection made by Sir Peter Blake, who was our associate artist back a few years ago in the National Gallery. And he was asked to create a pair to a painting of Highland cattle. And he chose to make an image after what was already, of course, a very famous image, Landseer's Monarch of the Glen. And this was back in the 1960s, in 1966, the era of pop art, when Peter Blake was making images that were often composites, drawing on the history of art, drawing on popular image. And in a way, I suppose you could say that this image brings together both. It's both almost a famous old master, and it's a popular image, well known from its appearance, as we said already, on whiskey, on soup, and on soap.
I think what you can see is that Blake did not opt for, a meticulous one-to-one copying of the Landseer. The colors seem different. They seem broader. They seem more consolidated. Part of that is because Blake, if I'm not mistaken, is actually working in acrylics here. So something that had been a fairly recent innovation in painting technique. In his time. The other thing is that in 1966, more and more artists were looking at reproduction, at techniques of reproduction, and in particular screen printing and printing techniques in general as a means of new approaches of making art rather than advertisement or commercial ways of reproducing things. Only recently had screen printing been adopted into the canon of fine art, and the aesthetics of screen printing make for consolidated colors, different color schemes, and something that Blake is actually doing in his transliteration almost of Landseer's painting. It becomes a painting about painting, but also about the reproduction and the proliferation of images.
So in the exhibition, when you finish looking at the Peter Blake, we invite you to cross over the landing and come and see Daniel's show, which is Rachel Maclean, the Lion and the Unicorn. So how did this come about? Why Rachel and why this film?
Yeah, for me as the curator of special projects, the idea was really to take our Landseer show as an opportunity to see how contemporary artists today benefit from looking at our collections and exhibitions, how certain traditions in art history don't just continue from one day to the next, but across generations and are really relevant to contemporary makers and practitioners now. Rachel Maclean is one of the most innovative, astute, and acerbic artists of her generation. She's 31 years old, I believe. And she was born in Edinburgh, lives and works in Glasgow, and has a very, very smart way of looking at image histories, looking at the construction of national identity and the representation in visual media. And for me, she was one of the clear candidates for a dialogue like this. So we were actually lucky in inviting Rachel to show a 2012 film of hers, The Rachel and the Unicorn? The Lion and the Unicorn, which takes its title from the heraldic attendants of the Royal Coat of Arms, the Scottish unicorn and the English lion. And Rachel makes a moving image work out of this, which we are showing in context of several prints. And I would love in the next couple of minutes to show you some examples of how an artist like Rachel Maclean is actually in dialogue with our collections and with the past, and with an artist like Landseer.
It's perhaps worth also noting that Rachel's been very involved in designing the entire setting for the film and her prints, as you'll see when you go into the show.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have the chance to have a look at our Sunley room after the discussion, please do look at her dressing of the entire room. She's very interested in set dressing, in as much as in other means of stagecraft. But she's very interested in fringing, in pink and blue colors, in the poofs, as I have now learned they're called, particular stage set devices for sitting on. So it's been a great fun exhibition to do, but also working with an artist who really understands that all these references of staging exhibitions reference the history of art, the history of institutions, and the history of exhibitions itself. She does that also in her film, The Lion and the Unicorn. It's only 11 minutes, so please do have a go and have a look at it. It starts with a frame story where we see the allegorical figure of a queen, half Mary King of Scots, half Queen Elizabeth, and maybe with a dash of just fairy tale queen in there as well. And we see this queen inviting us to the setting of Traquair House, a historic Jacobite house on the borders of Scotland. And she sets a frame story of introducing us to the main characters of the play, so to speak, which are the lion and the unicorn. And we can see the artist deliberately involving garish costumes, strange prosthetics, gaudy colors, and playing on the idea of tartan tat as a received idea of Scotland, as a received visualization of Scotland.
And Daniel, the extraordinary thing is that all these figures are played by Rachel herself.
That's true, yes. She, in general, she always plays all the characters in her films herself. She then uses green screen as a method to compose these films together in this historic setting. And she also composes, and in a way makes a composite, just like Landseer uses a composite method for his paintings. Rachel does that in the medium of film through found audio. So she uses existing audio, in her case, snippets and collaged bits and pieces from the Queen's 1957 Christmas address. So actually a piece of popular culture, one of the first addresses to the nation by the regent in the medium of television, but also snippets giving us the audio of Jeremy Paxton and Alex Salmond in the run-up to the Scottish independence referendum, discussing the ins and outs of fiscal policy, using both political discourse and what have become maybe popular culture items that the artist then mashes together and cuts and pastes into her works. In a way, we have, for instance, the lion with a garish wig, coming across as pompous in his red coat and addressing questions of sovereignty. At the same time, the artist shows us a Scottish unicorn in response, and how this character becomes quite gluttonous and finally doesn't succeed in its political ambitions, is also part of the story. It's, I think, important that the artist herself says that she does not try to take a position in this political debate, but rather wants to incite questions in the viewers, in us, to discuss the merits of the political question, but also the stagecraft of this political polemic that she exposes in her work.
It's extraordinarily cleverly done, I think, particularly the way in which she has sort of synced to the voices that she includes behind these characters. I mean, when you see them speak, it seems entirely natural, but at the same time, it's totally unnatural and very extraordinary. It's also extremely amusing, I think. I mean, she does have this fine satirical sense.
Yeah, and I think it's actually important for us as art historians, but also as visitors in museums to understand that satire, of course, is one of the very traditional tools of political analysis and of artistic analysis. In order to actually poke fun at something, we need to understand how it works. We need to be keenly appreciative of how something is done in order to successfully dismantle it and put it up for ridicule. And I think that is actually something Rachel does very well when it comes to art history, and her compositions in the digital prints that accompany her moving images. This is one of a series of three. It's a triptych, very traditional format of painting, of course. This is a print, St. George and the Monster, 2013, and we can see how we have an English St. George on a Scottish unicorn slaying a tartan dragon that in a kitschy way lays in a pool of North Sea oil on the floor.
Yes, I was interested in the North Sea oil because in the video, in the film, they drink a very viscous-looking dark wine, and I wondered whether that was intended to be oil, actually.
I suspect very strongly that it's a clear reference to North Sea oil and the wealth it brings, but also the gluttonous consumption thereof. I think it's also actually, in Rachel's case, a link to a very famous 1980s play from Scotland. I should know the title. I think it's called The Stag, and I'm sure somebody can tell me the title afterwards, but I think there's The Stag, The Sheep, and the Dark Oil, something like that. I need to look it up again. But there's a very particular political and entertainment, popular culture reference there. Here, of course, we have the reference to Paolo Uccello in terms of the St. George and the Dragon. As we found out, actually, only in our recent conversations with Rachel, the artist actually visited the National Gallery years ago in about 2012 to sketch from our paintings here in the gallery, and this is how some of the drawings which then made the prints came about. Satire, of course, is something that has been around for a long time, and in a way it's interesting for us to ask why it has come out of fashion. I would posit that nowadays the main mode of artistic appreciation and analysis is one of rather somber pontificating about art sometimes, of which I'm sure I am guilty of as well. But I think we should keep in mind that satire has been around for a very, very long time, and in particular the tradition of the grotesque is one that we very rarely engage in anymore nowadays, but that has been around as a staple in art history for a long time. Just as a case in point, we here have Quentin Massys and his Old Woman from around 1513 with her headdress and her very distinct facial features. The garishness of the dress and the satire of the attire is, I think, something that Rachel is very interested in, that we see an echo of in her 2013 print.
I mean, I wondered how unusual you thought it was for an artist today to be using humour in the way that she does.
I actually think it is, it's not completely uncommon. It's something that does happen a lot. But I think in a way we have a certain hierarchy of criticism at the moment, and the more maybe juvenalian sense of satire, of admonishing and reprimanding is more common in contemporary art criticism than it is than it used to be, and I'm not sure why that would be. I think there's a certain way that I think people sometimes are afraid of satire in the more Horatian sense. To maybe they're afraid of not having enough gravitas. Rachel doesn't have that hang-up. I think she's really interested in putting in the boot and twisting the knife and using a satirical mode of analysis to have us look differently at our world.
Can you say a bit more about what's going on in this particular image?
Yes, of course. So what we see on the left-hand side in her print from 2013 is that we have a little Hogarthian vignette that frames the image. There's tartan draped around it, and just as in a traditional still life, very often a piece of fruit seems to loom over the edge. We actually have a golf ball falling almost out of the painting into our field of vision.
Is that a Scottish symbol?
Exactly. I think that's very much what Maclean uses as a little pun and a little stab at her own country people to relish the game of golf, and of course the economic power that comes with it as well. Here, finally, we have a Scottish skeleton haunting Mary Queen of Scots, this allegorical figure that we can see in the center of the painting, with this very, very staged facial attire, with lipstick that's almost Orientalist in its way, and with the elaborate headdress and the tiara, the doings that we can see. All clad and presented in a very, very highly dramatic and highly staged and tongue-in-cheek fashion.
Well, you mentioned Hogarth. I was glad you mentioned Hogarth, because we do, of course, have the whole satirical series, The Marriage à la Mode, after which Hogarth had prints made. And they are a series of, I mean, it's a horrible satire, really, of the downfall of a family. It's shocking, but it is also extremely funny, and I guess there is a direct relationship in that way with what Rachel is doing.
I think so. It's very much a tradition, and a very strong British tradition that she works in as well, this idea of satire. And then, of course, with Hogarth, we have an echo of the image proliferation as well, that, yes, he was a painter, but he was just as astute a printmaker, publisher, and proliferator of his own images. Again, just to make the case about headdresses and satire and the grotesque being something that's firmly ingrained in the canon of art history that Rachel operates within. Here we've got the workshop of Marinius von Reimerswalde, two tax gatherers, two grotesque figures that are highly done up with headgear and in order to make a political point. And I think that is something that Rachel would have looked at when she made her films, when she did the sketches and the preliminary work for her films.
I think it's interesting that both these images you've chosen, the one we saw just now, the Metzits, which is known, of course, as the Ugly Duchess, because it was used in the Alice books for illustrations, and also this one. They're both 16th century paintings in which the sort of satirical intent is signalled by the fact that people are wearing headdresses and costume from an earlier age. So it's just like the way that Rachel is dressing up in a very, very similar way to send that signal that this is something satirical.
Yeah, and she's doing that actually in lots of different ways. One of the things that we're very happy about that will accompany the display that you can see in our Sunday room at the moment is a feature film length work that Rachel has recently commissioned, which has been shown on BBC4 recently, and which actually premiered here in our auditorium in October, a film that Rachel called Make Me Up, which is in a way a film that looks at the institutional complicity of art institutions and others in the creation of oppressive female body images. So it's a very strong work. It's extremely funny, also quite surprising and quite tough a view. But it's something that's a really important and timely work that also uses these grotesque aesthetics that she establishes, but also uses, if not headgear per se, then masks, prosthetics, and these signifiers of satire to make a point. In the case of that new film, it's actually the signifiers of contemporary culture, of teenage fashions, of online aesthetics, and the way people groom themselves for dating pictures nowadays. All of these things are elements that Rachel is interested in, and quite cleverly and acerically dissects, reframes, and presents to us in a very smart, astute, but also very funny fashion.
So I think that there's an enormous amount to be got out of Rachel's show, and in relation to Landseer's show, all of these ideas around Scottishness, satire, and so on. So if you haven't yet been able to catch either Landseer's Monarch of the Glen or Rachel Maclean's The Lion and the Unicorn, I hope you'll have the chance to go and see them now or very soon. But thank you very much for listening to us today.